Ulubaran. Ulubaran is a shipwreck in the Mediterranean. It is also a time machine, 1300 before the Common Era. The ship, however, reveals what is about to be a revelation to me again. After 1177 BC, The Survival of Civilization by Professor Eric Cline. This is a sequel to a book Eric and I spoke of many years ago, which includes the Ulubaran shipwreck. 1177 BC, the year civilization collapsed. This ship is understood to have not met its conditions and sunk. It's been recovered to a great extent. Its cargo is the Bronze Age. Professor, a very good evening to you. Thank you very much. This is a sentimental trip on my part because I wanted to talk to you again about your original genius, 1177 BC. And then I learned that you had a sequel. So here we are, not only the end of civilization, but its reawakening and revelations that may or may not be useful here in the 21st century. What is in the Ulubaran that demonstrates globalization at the time? Good evening to you, Professor.
Good evening, and thank you for having me on again. It's wonderful to be back some 10 years later with the sequel. The Ulubaran shipwreck basically is a microcosm of what was taking place during the late Bronze Age, say between 1500 BC and 1200 BC, give or take. On that ship, which went down in about 1300 BC, we have items from no fewer than 7 or 8 different civilizations. And it really shows it's a microcosm of the globalized network that was connecting all of the societies that went from the Western Mediterranean to the Eastern Mediterranean some 3,200, 3,300 years ago, including Mycenaeans, Minoans, Egyptians, Assyrians, Hittites, and so on. So as I say, for me, that shipwreck is a microcosm of what was going on at that time that it sank.
Copper ingots. Why, Eric?
Lots of copper ingots because you need them to make bronze. 90% copper, 10% tin will get you bronze. You can use arsenic instead of tin if you have to, but I wouldn't recommend that. You're not going to live very long. And the copper at that time, most of it is coming from Cyprus. So the ship had more than 300 copper oxide ingots weighing about 60 pounds each. It also had, that was about 10 tons of copper. The ship also had about a ton of tin. And if you put those together, you would have had enough bronze to outfit an army of 300 soldiers, as George Bass, the excavator of the shipwreck, once said. You could outfit the army with swords and shields and helmets and greaves and all of that. So when this ship went down, somebody lost a fortune, that's for sure.
24 ebony logs from Nubia. And I love this one. The revelation that the tin came from what is now Afghanistan.
More than likely, yes, from Afghanistan, Central Asia, maybe even up to, Turkmenistan, but from that general region, yes. Some of the tin in the late Bronze Age did come from what is now southeastern Turkey, ancient Anatolia, and there is some indication that, at least upon occasion, they may have gone as far as Cornwall in Britain. But as far as I'm concerned, the vast majority of the tin during the late Bronze Age is coming from Central Asia. So that's a very long trade route along which to bring the tin. And if it's cut at any point or at any time, you're going to be in real trouble.
And 140 Canaanite storage jars containing grapes, pomegranates, figs, coriander, and sumac, brand new pottery from Cyprus and Canaan. What we're describing is not just globalization, but sophisticated trade that Adam Smith would improve of.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. Those Canaanite storage jars are the shipping containers for the ancient world at that time. They can contain almost anything, as you just itemized, from food to glass beads. There was at least one jar that held thousands of glass beads. Also, terebinth resin from the pistachio tree, which you can use to help make perfume. So what we've got on board the ship and what was going around the Mediterranean is not only raw goods, especially metals, gold, silver, copper, and tin, but also finished goods, including, as you just mentioned, pottery, ceramic, lamps, and things like that.
And now the world ends, but not before we note that we've heard about this time, not just from Homer, but also from Egypt, because there's a small item on board, a scarab belonging to Nefertiti herself. Who is that, Eric?
Oh, extremely important small item. Yeah, Nefertiti, the wife of Akhenaten, the so-called heretic pharaoh, and they are ruling in the middle of the 14th century BC. This particular scarab is very important for two reasons. One, it's solid gold, which is rather unusual. But secondly, her name is spelled Neferu Neferu Aten, which is the name that she used for the first 5 years of her rule when her husband Akhenaten was busy messing with the religion of ancient Egypt at that time. So to find an item like that on board the ship is one thing that we dream of because it helps us to date the wreck. We know that the wreck could not have gone down, before her rule. It has to be after she started ruling. And chances are pretty good that she was dead by the time her scarab made it on board because, well, we don't know if they would have sent a scarab like that out during her lifetime. But regardless, it is one of the items on the wreck that allows us to date it, along with radiocarbon dating of the timbers from the hull and even dendrochronology, both from the timbers and some of the brush that was up on top of the ship. So we've got 3 or 4 different ways to date the shipwreck, including used Mycenaean and Minoan pottery. So all told, with that scarab and the others, that's why we know it goes down in about 1300 BC.
Now the world ends, and that's important here. This is the climax of the first volume, 1177. How many elements came together to form that perfect storm, Eric?
Lots. So 1177, that year comes from the fact that that is the second time the Egyptians tell us that a bunch of groups that we lump together collectively and call the Sea Peoples, the Egyptians tell us this is the second time that they attacked in 2 waves, one by land and one by sea. And this is Ramses III that is telling us the story in 1177 BC. But the Sea Peoples are just one part of the collapse. And in fact, they might be as much victims as they are oppressors, because there is also drought, famine, invaders / migrants, which is what the Sea Peoples are, disease, earthquakes. It literally is a perfect storm of catastrophic events that happen either virtually simultaneously or one after the other so quickly that they didn't have time to recover from one calamity before the next one hit.
And this is the overarching theme of Eric's work here, the professor's work, that the image that I like that he gives us is a watch with 8 or 9 moving gears. And can it survive losing one gear? And it would appear that it cannot, Eric. Did you come to a conclusion? Could they have lost any one of these? The Minoans, the Hittites, the Assyrians, any one could have bowed out and the others would have gone on in this global trade? Have you come to an opinion?
Yes, actually, I have, courtesy of the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, with whom I just finished a study that's actually just been published a couple of months ago, in which we did computer modeling, seeing exactly that, testing. If the Mycenaeans dropped out, would that bring the whole network down? Or if the Egyptians dropped out? And it turns out, after running thousands of simulations, that really the only one that works is if the Hittites and the port city of Ugarit go down almost simultaneously, which we know they did. And those two dropping out at just about the same time is enough to take down the whole network. But when running the simulations, if the Mycenaeans drop out, that's not enough to affect the whole thing. Same with the Egyptians, same with the Cypriots. The only scenario is if two go down at once, and in particular, the Hittites and Ugarit. So that was an interesting finding that is in neither of the books because we just finished it and just published it.
Ugarit is the trading port, the nexus for the trade routes itself. And that was damaged. My memory, because it's been 10 years, forgive me, Professor, my memory is that it was the earthquake that hit Ugarit. Is that correct?
Well, an earthquake did hit Ugarit, but it was slightly earlier. We know there was one in the middle of the 14th century. But in fact, we have new data, and that is one of the reasons why I put out the revised version of the original book in 2021, because several more texts, which had been untranslated, were published by the French in 2016, which was after the original book came out, and then retranslated into English by 2019, 2020 by a friend of mine, Yuri Cohen. And those new texts, which make it into the revised version, talk about famine in Ugarit. They explicitly say there's famine and they ask the Egyptians for help. But even more importantly, they mention that an invader, an unnamed invader, they just call him the enemy, has overrun their own port city, place called Ras Ibn Hani, and that they are on their way to Ugarit. Please send help. Please send reinforcements. And they send that to the Hittites up in Carchemish. Well, obviously, reinforcements did not get there because the city is burnt to the ground. There's a meter, 3 feet of destruction with ash and everything else, including arrowheads embedded in the walls. So Ugarit is hit by pretty much everything that could have hit it within the span of 100 years. You're right. There's an earthquake, there's drought, there's famine, and there's invaders. So I say in the revised version of the original book that they they pretty much are the poster child for what could have gone wrong and in fact did go wrong at the end of the late Bronze Age.
The new work is after 1177 BC, the survival of civilizations. We're about to see who wins and who loses after the catastrophes. Eric Cline is the author. The world has ended. Combination of accident and intervention and invasion and migration. But we look to who survives, who adapts, who's resilient. And we start with the Assyrians because they're in the Bible and they're easy to remember. The professor teaches me, however, that the Assyrians were successful because they were almost always at war. And one particular king of the Assyrians was extremely successful on identifying what you recommend, Professor, is if you're going to survive, you need leadership, and the Assyrians had it.
Yes, absolutely. That's one of the things that I do in the final chapter of this new sequel is try to figure out why some of the societies, the G8 as I call them, why some of them were more resilient, why they were able to make it through the collapse better than others. And the Assyrians are one of the best examples. They've got redundant systems in place. For example, they still have their military, they still have writing, they still have their government, the king is still in place. And that's where having a good leader at the right time might come in. And so we know from their records, which we have for much of the time, though there's an interesting gap right at the beginning, we know that their leaders, as you say, are busy conducting war almost every year. And in part, it's because the people that they had been happily trading with back in the late Bronze Age, they're having trouble. They don't have trading partners per se anymore. So they simply take what they need during these next couple of centuries.
The Assyrians always at war, conquering and raiding and pushing out from what was originally Ashur, and then their capital moves to Nineveh. They move in tandem with the Babylonians. What was their relationship? Was Babylon a surrogate, a subordinate at this time, early on?
At this time, there are actually, well, on and off relations between allies and enemies. In fact, right after the collapse, the Assyrians and the Babylonians go at it. They're busy fighting each other. And the various kings tell us this. And we, in fact, have inscriptions from the Assyrians that tell us this. We've also got the synchronistic history, the Assyrian and Babylonian chronicles that tell us that they were on again, off again at war or allied. So sometimes the Babylonians, or by this point they are the Neo-Babylonians, are subservient to the Neo-Assyrians, and sometimes they are equals, and sometimes they flip positions. And of course, eventually, the Neo-Babylonians are going to defeat the Neo-Assyrians and take over with their own empire. But that's not going to happen until the late 7th century. So we have a couple of centuries, especially from the 9th century on, where the Neo-Assyrians are the dominant force in the Near East at that time after the collapse. But eventually they will they will be upended by the Neo-Babylonians. And we start seeing then the rise and fall of empires, because the Neo-Babylonians then get upended by the Persians, who get upended by the Greeks, who get upended by the Romans. And so, as they said in Hamilton, oceans rise, empires fall. I believe that's the line from Hamilton. So the Neo-Babylonians and the Neo-Assyrians had a complex relationship. Let's put it that way.
Leadership, you can make it through, you can cope, but there are more lessons. The book is After 1177 BC, The Survival of Civilizations. Eric Cline is the author. This is the Bronze Age, ending in a series of catastrophes, but it's about to introduce the Iron Age. The way to think about this in terms of literature is the Odyssey and the Iliad are the Bronze Age. The Iron Age that follows looks a whole lot like the Old Testament. So right now we're going to go to Israel at the time and the Israelites via Egypt. Professor, there are lessons to be learned about how some of the big eight, big seven, big six, the global traders of 1300 BC, how the ones succeeded and the ones that didn't. Egypt had a series of rulers from Ramses III. I believe he was murdered by his wife and his son, or her son, to Ramses XI. And this is the 22nd dynasty. What do we find in there that tells us the catastrophes of 1177 is wearing them down? What's in there?
So in the aftermath of the collapse, and Ramses III is the one who defeats the Sea Peoples that we've mentioned in 1177, but he is then, as you just mentioned, assassinated, apparently by his wife and son, a minor wife, and his mummy's been found with his throat slashed. So after him, there's a series of additional pharaohs that actually 19th, 20th into the 21st and onward in terms of dynasties. And we wind up with Egypt not doing so well, if I could put it that way. They do manage to survive, but they are merely coping in the aftermath of the collapse rather than transforming or even adapting. They are merely coping. And we find ourselves in the centuries after the collapse in Egypt in what is known as the Third Intermediate Period, which is a time of, shall we say, anarchy and chaos, such that at one point we've got no fewer than 3 or even 4 different people calling themselves pharaoh in different regions of Egypt. So the upshot for us is that Egypt, which had been one of the major players on the international stage, supplying gold, for instance, to most of the other great powers. Egypt now retreats to a certain extent from that international stage and is busy coping at home with their own problems, including a bit of a delayed reaction to the drought that had hit everyone earlier. It looks like Egypt was saved for a little bit because of the Nile, but then lack of rainfall up in the Ethiopian highlands eventually subjects even Egypt to the drought as well. So they, I would say, almost muddle through these centuries after the collapse with a couple of high points, a couple of pharaohs like Sheshonq, who may be Shishak of the Bible, do provide some high points. But overall, the Egyptians don't fare as well as, say, the Assyrians did.
I'm glad you mentioned the Bible because this is a lesson that I take from this, that peak Egypt is past, and they're coping, as you say, correctly.
That
But
is
at the
correct.
same time, there are opportunities here, and one of the opportunities is people to emerge from the highlands. We speculate. Did the Israelites come from the highlands? Did they come from migration? Did they come from the sea peoples? Were they part of the Philistines? Probably not. Were they brought in and revolt, as the Bible tells us? And I'm very pleased that so many of the citations that archaeology uses are out of the Old Testament. And I take it that many of the names in the Old Testament, the Bible, are now considered to be guideposts for archaeology and no longer seen as literary. Is that correct, Professor?
Mm. Yes, especially in the first millennium BC, what we get, which we don't really have back in the second millennium, the time of the patriarchs and even down to Moses, where we don't have what we call extra biblical records, that is, inscriptions apart from the Hebrew Bible. Now, in the first millennium, especially with Assyrian records, we get people mentioned like Ahab, king of Israel, Omri, Jehu. We get these figures now mentioned outside the Bible, which scholars want as corroboration, right? Me personally, I like three separate lines of evidence. So if we have somebody mentioned in the Bible and mentioned in an Assyrian inscription, and we have archaeological evidence for something that's been attested in their reign, then I'm good to go. And so we do get that now in the first millennium. But even if we go back for a second to the collapse and the whole question of Egypt and the Israelites and what happened, there we get into the questions of the Exodus. You know, did it happen? And if so, when did it happen? And, this is a question on which archaeologists are still divided. And then the question of the Israelite conquest of Canaan, because even in the Bible itself, the book of Judges versus the book of Joshua, one says that when the Israelites come in, it's a genocide of the Canaanites that had been there. And the other book says, no, it was more of a peaceful assimilation and that they lived together side by side. So this also comes to one of the questions that I ask in the sequel. What happened to the southern Canaanites in what is now, say, Sinai and that region, which the Egyptians have been in control of up until the collapse? And where were the Israelites? There are some archaeologists that think the Israelites were already in the land of Canaan and were up in the highlands. In which case, after the collapse, they may have simply come down from the highlands and have transformed. They would be an example of a successful transformation. But if the Israelites come in as, say, part of the Exodus, taking advantage of the collapse, then they're simply migrating into the region, in which case they're not really transforming at all. They're newcomers. And we have the same thing with the Edomites and the Moabites and the Ammonites. Big discussions among the academic scholars. Are these new people coming into the region taking advantage of the power vacuum? Or are they people that had already been there and kind of invisible, like nomads during the late Bronze Age, and now they settle down? So these are ongoing questions that we're investigating, which to my mind makes the whole period even more interesting. But it does show that the collapse at the end of the late Bronze Age allows these new, smaller kingdoms and city-states like Israel, like Judah, like Edom, like Moab. It allows them to flourish where they hadn't been able to flourish before, since they would have been in the shadow of the larger empires. So all of this is ongoing research. I do not profess to answer anything. I am simply alerting the public as to the ongoing discussions. And frankly, I think how fascinating they are.
3 cities you name: Ashdod, Ashkelon, and Gaza. I've been to Ashkelon, I've been to Gaza. It's in the news all the time. It's a crossroads. It always has been in the Levant. Are the Philistines the sea people? And were the Philistines in those 3 cities? It's the question that comes to me after reading your book.
Yes, first of all, the Philistines are in those 3 cities, plus 2 more. They're also in the site of Ekron, which is Tel Mikna, and they're in the site of Gath, which is Tel Safi. And 4 of the 5 have been excavated. Gaza has never been excavated, and who knows if it will be now, or if it's even still there. But these are the 5 cities of the Philistines. The Bible calls them the Pentapolis. And so we've got all of those. And in fact, very interesting. Well, let me back up for a second. The Philistines are definitely part of the Sea Peoples. They are probably the group that the Egyptians call the Peleset. So the Peleset would be the Philistines. We've been able to identify their pottery and various other cultural items like their architecture and such for more than 100 years now. And most recently in the city of Ashkelon, a couple of young children, their bodies were excavated. They are not sea peoples themselves. They're from about 100 years later, but their grandparents were probably Peleset, because the DNA that was extracted and studied from these 4 little kids show that they are partly local Canaanite and partly other. And the computer models indicate the other is most likely Crete or Sardinia or Spain, which is all places that we have suggested the Philistines might have come from. So these 4 little kids are the descendants of part of the original Sea Peoples, which is very exciting.
The book is after 1177 BC, the survival of civilizations. Civilization collapsed, the globalization trade collapsed, but there were big winners, called technically anti-fragile. Guess. One came with the alphabet, maybe. The other came with iron, maybe. The Phoenicians, who the professor tells me never called themselves Phoenicians. They identified with cities, Tyre and Sidon and Beirut, Byblos. Those traders. And then there are the genius metallurgists of Cyprus. And this is important to mention because we're talking about how you deal with collapse. The Assyrians dealt with it with leadership. The Egyptians dealt with it by retracting. They took a recession. The Phoenicians and the Cypriots are opportunists. Accidentally, Professor, or were they geniuses?
I'm going to go with genius rather than accidental. It seemed very deliberate. But yes, both the Phoenicians and the Cypriots are at the top of my list. They're the top ranked people in terms of how you deal with a collapse, how you deal with catastrophe when your society and or your globalized network go down. What do you do when there are supply chain issues and so on? The Phoenicians and the Cypriots, as you mentioned, are what I call anti-fragile, which is a term that I've borrowed from Nassim Nicholas Taleb, who has a book of that title. And he defines anti-fragile as when you flourish in conditions of chaos, which is perfect for what happened after the collapse. Basically, the Phoenicians, who are in what is today modern-day Lebanon, they are the surviving Canaanites in central Canaan. There is no evidence that they really ever went down. They simply pick up and continue, but they do transform. Same thing with the Cypriots. So what the Phoenicians do, one of their secrets is that they're right there on the Mediterranean, and they take over from Ugarit when Ugarit is destroyed. And so, as one of my colleagues has called it, the Mediterranean becomes a Phoenician lake, and they sail out, founding colonies, including Carthage, which will eventually become a power great enough to challenge Rome in the Punic Wars centuries later. But the Phoenicians are bringing two things. They're bringing purple dye, for which they're justifiably famous, but they have also standardized the alphabet, and they spread the alphabet everywhere they go, which becomes what we now know as the Greek alphabet on the one hand and the Latin alphabet on the other. And of course, we use the Latin alphabet today still to write English and French and German and Italian and Spanish. So that's the Phoenicians. And you're right, they never called themselves Phoenicians. That's what the later Greeks, like Herodotus, called them. They would have said, I'm from Tyre, I'm from Sidon, I'm from Beirut. The Cypriots, on the other hand, who, as we mentioned, were the ones that were providing all the copper in the late Bronze Age, they make a turn, and they seem to be the first ones to start working with iron. And they not only send iron weapons and tools around the Mediterranean, they also send the techniques and the technology. And we frequently find both Phoenician and Cypriot artifacts at the same sites at the same time during this period, which is now called the Early Iron Age for exactly that reason, that they've turned from bronze to iron.
The question about the iron. You introduced the question, so I'll ask it aloud. Was the iron of necessity because the supply chain was broken, or was it genius?
Um, good question to which I have no answer. I'm going to lean towards genius, but it used to be thought that the trade routes were cut and that they were unable to get tin. And tin at that time, of course, was equivalent to our need for petroleum, or more recently, our need for, rare earths like lithium to make the chips that run our cars and our computers. And if the trade routes from Central Asia were cut and you couldn't get tin anymore, then you couldn't make bronze, and then you're up the creek. And that is why they changed to iron out of necessity. More recently, it's been suggested that there might not have been as much of a shortage of tin as had been previously supposed, but that they changed anyway. This period is a time of innovation and invention, and I do think we need to give credit, as others have, to the Cypriots for making the transition. They don't give up bronze, but iron becomes the metal that they're using. So it turns out that once you're able to figure out how to smelt iron, because it's a very different process than making bronze, but once you can make iron, it's better for weapons and for tools and everything else. The one thing that I am at pains to say in the sequel, and I'll repeat here just very quickly, there are lots of people on the internet that say, the Sea Peoples, they took over and everything because they had iron weapons. And the answer to that is no. Iron weapons and tools do not come into use until after the collapse. They are not a reason for the collapse. So we see the transition in the later 12th century into the 11th century and all that. But once they do transition, it's better for all concerned because all of the countries have iron ore. It's readily available. You're not dependent on somebody else.
Bronze. Patroclus's armor, pretending to be Achilles, was bronze. Iron is after Homer, and we're going to come back to that because the professor introduces us to the possible origin of Homer's heroes. But at this moment, Professor, I just want to make a note here before we leave the Phoenicians. There's been a dive by Bob Ballard, who found the Titanic, but his dive to a ship that was headed to Carthage. Is that the way to read this, that they were trading with Carthage this early?
Well, the Phoenicians have founded Carthage. It's one of their colonies. So they're sending ships back out because one of the reasons for the Phoenician colonies and for the Greek colonies that will come along fairly soon after this period is the colony is supposed to send raw materials back to the mother city, and the mother city sends finished goods to the colony. So these two ships, in fact, that Bob Ballard excavated along with Larry Stager of Harvard, these are two ships that were being sent between the Phoenician cities and their colony, Carthage. And they were fascinating ships. They were not quite as famous as Uluburun, but just as important for this later period.
The reason I wanted to make a deal of that is that means Carthage is older than Rome, a superior colony.
Yes, you could say so. There are debates as to when Carthage was actually founded. It's certainly founded by the 8th century BC for sure, but that in fact is about the time that Rome seems to be starting. I mean, you've got the traditional date of, I think it's 753 BC with Romulus and Remus, and certainly there are early villages on the Palatine in the area of Rome that are from the 8th century. So I would say they're almost kind of neck and neck. Yes, Phoenicia and Carthage might be a little bit earlier, but we're all in the same ballpark here.
The book is After 1177 BC, The Survival of Civilization, a sequel to his original idea, 1177 BC, the year civilization collapsed, which is now revised and updated for everyone to together. It's important to note that the Bronze Age was globalization, trade of 7 or 8 empires intermixed in the Eastern Mediterranean, trade routes established, making bronze, tin from Afghanistan, copper from Cyprus and other mines in the Mediterranean basin, the same for clothing, the same for spices, the same for gold, coming from all over. Adam Smith would approve of the Bronze Age. However, it then crashed suddenly with a combination that the professor can list, but they were all bad things happening at the same time. Some survived and some didn't. We've talked about the survivors so far. Now we're going to go to the failures. The Hittites. The reason you don't know that name is because they failed. Professor, the Hittites were Turkey, were Anatolian Heights. They had a vast area to develop. They were a powerful empire, and they failed. My reading of your explication, because there are a series of decisions that they make and from their capital, Hattusa, is that they had bad leadership. What else went wrong with them? Thank you.
So they do have bad leadership at the end. You're quite right. But in their heyday, they were to be reckoned with. I mean, the Hittites as a whole are in central Anatolia, modern day Turkey, from about 1700 BC until 1200 BC. They were on a par with ancient Egypt at its height, 18th dynasty. Akhenaten, Amenhotep III, names like Shuppi-Luliuma I and Hattushilis III. In fact, there's a famous battle that they fight with between the Hittites and the Egyptians, the Battle of Kadesh in about 1279 BC, which ended in a tie and the world's first recorded peace treaty, of which I think there's a portion at the United Nations. But by the time 1200 BC swings around, the Hittites are already in decline. They had been ravaged by a plague that had wiped out the Hittite royal family. Shuppi-Luliuma I, in fact, about 1340 BC, had died of the plague, as had most of his family. And the survivors showed very poor leadership. In fact, there seems to have been a schism between various members. And one of the kings had, in fact, seems to have abandoned the capital city of Hattusa and moved the capital. So when the collapse came, we see, for example, letters written by the Hittite kings and queens down to Egypt saying, there's a famine in my land. Do you not know this? It's a matter of life and death. And one of the last Hittite kings, Tutaliya IV, actually puts up a whole line of gods and goddesses inscribed on standing large outcrop of rock called Yaslikaya. But yes, this is not a good time to be a Hittite, and especially it looks like their capital city of Hattusa is then attacked and burned, not by the sea peoples, but perhaps by one of their age-old enemies, the Kashka, coming down from the northeast. So they are unable to unify after about the time of Tutolia IV and Shuppiluliuma II. I love saying their names. They're absolutely wonderful names. I actually wanted to name my kids one of them Shuppiluliuma, but my wife objected for, I don't know why, but so it goes. At any rate, poor leadership would be the best explanation. And the Hittites per se go down. They go away. Their society collapses, the economy, the government, and they are overtaken. We get other peoples moving in. We get the Phrygians over to the west. We get the Urartians over to the east. And indeed, the Hittites in central Anatolia go away such that we had lost them to history. We didn't even know the Hittites were up there until about 100 years ago, maybe a little bit more. The one thing that does remain are what we call their rump states. That is, at their heyday, the Hittites had not only controlled all of Anatolia, all the way to the west coast where Troy is, but they had also controlled what we would now see as northern Syria. And those little city-states in North Syria, they survive and they become the Neo-Hittites or the Syro-Hittites. And they're going to be successful, but the main body goes away. The way I say it, it's like the British Empire, which is not around today anymore, but places that had been in the British Empire, even today, still drink tea and, play soccer. And so it's kind of that situation here as well. So even, archaeologists have lost the Hittites, but these Neo-Hittites in North Syria, those are the ones that the Bible knows. And where the Bible mentions the Hittites, they're talking about these hangers-on in what is northern Canaan, but not Hittite Empire proper.
We come to the city of Carchemish, one of those remnants of the Hittites, which is well placed. The professor tells me it's exactly divided by the sovereign border of Turkey and Syria, so dangerous place to try to excavate. But Carchemish never asserts itself. It feels like a Euphrates-based Ugarit. Is that how it functioned itself? As sort of a trading center?
Yes, essentially. And new excavations have just begun in the last decade or so, and they had to make sure that all the mines that had been put there on the border had been taken out before they began excavating. It does turn out that Carchemish flourishes during this time period. What's interesting is that Ramses III had specifically mentioned it in his inscription as 1177 as having been overrun, and yet the archaeologists have not found any evidence of that destruction, which is intriguing. So we've got to figure that out. But the new excavations, especially, and the earlier excavations by the British, Hogarth was there in 1911 or so, they show that Carchemish, again, I wouldn't call it totally anti-fragile, but it does adapt. And we have a whole line of kings that rule in these centuries. It's not just Carchemish, by the way, but the other little cities and city-states around it as well. There's one site, Tel Tayanat, that has been excavated by the University of Toronto for the last decade or so. And that also shows that this area as a whole is a commercial nexus or nub once again. But they are all constantly under threat by the Neo-Assyrians, who attack them and demand tribute on an almost yearly basis.
We need to mention one Assyrian king at this point, the Battle of Qarqar, Shalmaneser III. I note that Carchemish pays tribute to him, but at the same time, did Carchemish contribute soldiers to the Battle of Qarqar? I know the Israelites did. Did Carchemish?
Yeah, it says that they've all of these. We have all right. So we have an inscription from Shalmaneser III, the Neo-Assyrian king, in about 853 BC, and he actually names all the people that are lined up against him. And so Carchemish is in there, the Israelites are in there, Egypt is in there. In fact, that's where we get a mention of Ahab the Israelite coming with men and chariots. Shalmaneser was victorious, though. He beat them all, including the contingent from Carchemish. And in fact, he then goes on and names a number of different times in other inscriptions. One particular ruler, a guy named Sangar, Sangar, who seems to be a king of Carchemish round about this time, and just wails on the guy for decades, exacting tribute and so on. So the Battle of Qarqar is one of our most important dates and linchpins at this time because it ties together a lot of the societies that we're talking about here. In fact, the Neo-Assyrians are the thread that runs through much of my sequel because they also attack the Phoenicians and get tribute from them, as well as the Neo-Hittite states, and of course, then famously, the Israelites, and eventually the people down in Judah as well, which actually gets beyond the time frame that's covered in the sequel, just barely, because I stop at about 776 in the first Olympics, and all that takes place later in the 8th century. But the Neo-Assyrians do a number on all of these people, and Battle at Carchemish at about 853 BC, as I said, is one of the hallmarks of this period.
Qarqar, yes. To the Assyrians, I get the impression everything is a nail. We're going to turn to the Minoans and the Mycenaeans next. That's Greece. The book is After 1177 BC, The Survival of Civilization. And we come now to the Minoans, which we know as Crete, and the Mycenaeans, which we know as not the mainland, a series of islands that are attached, the Peloponnese, the mainland where Athens is, but this is early on. And so the question is, how did they survive, or did they? And herein, Professor, I divide into the Mycenaeans and the Minoans on Crete. The Minoans were builders. The Mycenaeans were okay builders, but they inherited a lot, if I read this correctly. The Minoans were building huge operations, sort of like Belt and Road Initiative. Why that looked to be a creation of genuine superiority. Why did it fall apart?
Well, these are good questions. But what we've got basically in the late Bronze Age, we've got the Minoans on Crete, and Sir Arthur Evans excavated the site of Knossos. But and it is on the Greek mainland mainly that we've got the Mycenaeans, sites like Mycenae, where Agamemnon may have ruled, and Tiryns and Pylos. And they also do have pretty amazing structures like the Land Gate at Mycenae. They're actually kind of rivals, the Minoans and the Mycenaeans at that time. They're both known overseas. The Egyptians called the Minoans Keftiu and the Mycenaeans Tanaya. And eventually, actually, the Mycenaeans take over Crete before the end. And so that may have helped contribute to the demise of the Minoans. But overall, in my categorization, the Minoans and Mycenaeans are down towards the bottom. They're almost examples of what not to do. But why that is the case is still a question. It's a dilemma because the writing that we've got, Linear B, as it's called, which is an early form of Greek, Linear B, which is an early form of Greek, is used mostly just for accounting purposes. What came into the palace, what went out of the palace. We don't have, early copies of Homer. We don't have histories, songs, poems, things like that. So we don't have anybody recording for us why it went down. We don't even have any indication of whether there was poor leadership or not. But what seems to be appearing is that they may have been more fragile and more vulnerable than was obvious to external appearances, right? Like having a tree that is rotted internally, but you can't see it from outside. And it's only when wind or a stressor hits it that it falls over. And so we are now thinking that, especially in the case of the Mycenaeans on the mainland, that that is what had happened, that they may have overextended the period before the collapse in Greece actually seems to be a pretty good period in terms of rain and agriculture and all that. And they may have overextended, but they are also doing construction projects that are too long, are too big, too ambitious. Draining the Copaeus Basin, for example, building the land gate at Mycenae, and the peasants that they are using as cannon fodder to build these may have they may have rebelled when there's drought and famine. There may have been internal uprisings in Greece. So this is one of the things that I explore in the sequel is it possible for a society like the Minoans, like the Mycenaeans, that appear outwardly to be so vibrant and successful to actually internally be rotted from the inside? And that, I think, may hold lessons for us today, if one is so inclined to look at it, that something that looks like it's doing well might actually not be doing so well. So I think Minoans and Mycenaeans are a complicated case here. The end result is, after the collapse, there is no one that calls themselves Mycenaeans or Minoans after about the 11th century BC. Takes a little while, but then their societies go away just as completely as the Hittites did. That doesn't mean there aren't survivors. And the membrane is permeable between the Bronze Age and the Iron Age, such that the names of the gods and goddesses from Linear B and the Bronze Age still continue in the Iron Age. Zeus, Hera, Poseidon, Ares, and those. But things have changed. The Wanax, the great king, there's nobody like that in the Iron Age. Now it's the Basileus, who had been a minor person back then. So one of the questions we've got, and you mentioned Homer and the Iliad and the Odyssey, is he, who is writing at the end of the 8th century BC, but describing the Trojan War that happens in the 12th century, is his account accurate? And if it is it for the Bronze Age or is it for the Iron Age? That is, has the story changed over the 400 years of being handed down by word of mouth? So we use Homer very cautiously, and yet it's intriguing to see what he says.
The questions are in the graves. We're going to the graves next. Several graves excavated ask even bigger questions than I've ever confronted. I was taught in the 20th century that we knew what the Greeks were. No. The book is After 1177 BC, The Survival of Civilizations. Eric Cline is the author. 8 empires trading with each other. There was friction, but they traded. Collapsed. 1, 1, 1. But some survived, some coped, some were resilient, some failed. We're dealing with a non-survivor in the Minoan and the Mycenaean, but there are clues about a very famous story. It's called the Trojan War. And I go to the clues thanks to the professor's explication of 2 graves in particular. One, the hero of Lefkandi, a man cremated, buried, and next to him, a woman, I believe not cremated, but the professor will correct me. And then some clues around, such as a knife or grave grave jewelry all around them. More importantly, they're under a building, the building on top of them. And more importantly, the building was going to be wiped out by a local farmer until he was stopped. And now the mystery. Professor also speaks of cold cases. This is a very cold case, but it tells us a deal about the Mycenaeans, I believe, and the people of Lefkandi, which is a peninsula north of Athens, north of the Athenian peninsula. Professor, what do we know about this burial? What does it tell us? What can we guess?
So absolutely fascinating. So we're up on the the island of Euboea or Evia. Lefkandi is a site on that area. As you say, it's to the northeast of Athens and Attica. And this is one of the most important sites that we've got from the early Iron Age as we come out of the collapse. So 10th century, 9th century. And what we're looking at in particular with this grave, which you correctly mentioned, the man is cremated and is in a jar. The woman is not cremated. She's simply buried with him in the same grave. There is a knife that was found near her, and there are conjectures that she may have been sacrificed at the time to accompany the man into the afterlife, but we don't know their connections. Wife, mistress, I mean, who knows? But they are together there. And then in a grave next to them are the remains of a couple of horses that have been buried as well. The graves themselves, as you mentioned, are underneath the floor of a very large building, perhaps the largest building that we know of from this particular period. And it's been suggested that perhaps the man was the basileus, right, the leader of the community at that time, though there's no way to prove that one way or the other because there's no writing that accompanies him. What does accompany them, though, she has, as part of her jewelry, has an heirloom from the Bronze Age, several centuries old by that point, and he is buried with a vessel, as I said, in a vessel that has connections to the Near East, the Phoenicians, the Cypriots, and so on. So they are buried underneath the floor in this large building, and then covering the building at some point was erected a large mound of earth so that when you came to it, you did not see the building, you did not see the graves, you saw this huge mound of earth. Now, this is what's known as to us, as a heroon. It is a cult place where somebody would worship in the Iron Age the remains from earlier than that, either earlier in the Iron Age or in particular from the Bronze Age. This is known as a hero cult. The question is the order in which they were built. So, for instance, I'll just give you one possibility. Is the building put up first? Is it constructed first? And then after the man and the wife or woman died, they are buried underneath the floor, which can be quite common. Or were they already buried and then the building was on top of them later? And then even afterward, the mound was put up there. So in my mind, and again, it's an ongoing discussion, I think the building was there. I think he was one of the leaders, and that when he died, he and his consort, wife, mistress were buried underneath, and then they erected this mound to commemorate it. And that's what the farmer was trying to get rid of with his bulldozer so he could build a summer home there, and the archaeologists stopped him. But it's a matter of dispute. The one thing that we do know is that Lefkandi does show evidence that the trade routes are re-emerging, that they are reconnecting by this point, and that Cypriots and Phoenicians are coming to Greece once again, if they had ever stopped, the 10th, 9th century. So Lefkandi, extremely important. And they're not the only type of burial like this. There are others found elsewhere where you have quite often a cremated man and an inhumation of a woman with him.
Athenian lady, cremated, urn. But the question is, was she alone? This is a fascination. Found with jewelry. What do they believe now? What does she tell us?
So the Athenian lady, who was found quite a long time ago, she shows that Athens at this time, that's where she was found in the cemetery there, Athens by the 9th century into the 8th century is coming back. I mean, by the early 8th century, Greece has rebounded, but it has taken almost 400 years for them to do that. Greece is actually the area of all the ones I discussed in the sequel, that takes the longest to come back. Right, so the Athenian lady is in that latter part of the period, showing again that contacts have come back in by this point, that they may have been more wealthy than we expected. But as you refer, she was not alone. It turns out, re-examination by John Papadopoulos and Mariah Liston indicates that she had a child, unborn, a small fetus, small infant, buried with her. And the original archaeologist and the bone specialist, J. Lawrence Angel, had suspected that, but couldn't prove it. But these two now, Papadopoulos and Liston, have shown that she, in fact, was carrying a child, may even have died in childbirth for all that it's worth, but was definitely not alone. So that does solve one of the mysteries that from that time period. But there are also other interesting burials nearby in the same region in
Tomb
Athens.
3, Tomb 213. Let's go to that one, Eric.
Tomb 213. That's our hero. Yes, the man who is buried and has an iron sword bent and wrapped around the top of the jar in which he is buried. So the question is, what was he? Warrior, leader, whatever. But he had his weapon ritually killed along with him so that he could take it, I guess, into the afterlife, or at least so that nobody else could use it. And so these two tombs are emblematic of the fact that Greece is on its way back up. As I say, it's taken quite a while, but once they get going, once we get into the 8th century, then you're off and running with Homer and Hesiod, and then later Sappho, and archaic Greece, classical Greece. And you're going to get eventually a democracy and a little building called the Parthenon, and so on. So once Greece makes it back, it makes the most of it, shall we say.
Heroes Homeric burying. These graves, do they point to the Iliad and the Odyssey having historical weight?
Well, they may, and to a certain degree. And I have to say, I'm one of the people that thinks there are portions of Homer that are accurate and that we can use. Again, very cautiously with a grain of salt. For example, Book 2 of the Iliad, there's the catalog of ships where they say Agamemnon came with this many ships and Menelaus came with this many ships, and so on. That, I think, is a fairly accurate remembrance of what went on in the Bronze Age. Other portions of Homer, though, problematic. For instance, Patroclus being cremated. That's Iron Age. They're doing inhumations in the Bronze Age. Cremations are Iron Age practice, like we just saw with the man from Lefkandi and so on. So their Homer's not to be trusted in terms of reconstructing the Bronze Age. But other things we can say actually quite easily. Yes, this element is Iron Age, this element is Bronze Age, because remember, they're handing the story down by word of mouth for 4 centuries. And so just as you try to make something contemporary so the audience can understand it even today, so they would have changed the story slightly. The one thing I will add is that to me, the Trojan War, actually, I'm sure it happened. There is something there. There's a kernel of truth, because the Hittite records talk about 4 different conflicts at the site that they call Wilusa, which is Ilios, Troy. And so for me, it's not a question, did the Trojan War take place? It's a question of which of the Trojan Wars is Homer talking about, and the time period, the time frame. The collapse is the perfect period for the Trojan War to have taken place. And indeed, the archaeology tends to support that at the site that Schliemann excavated, and then later people at Hissarlik. The Trojan War definitely, I think, took place. The question is, what do we use from Homer and not?
The book is after 1177 BC, The Survival of Civilizations. Eric Cline is the author, like a really good melodrama. It gives us a moment at the end that if we change our ways, we can get out of this trouble. So we come to, how do we get out of this trouble? I'm going to lead with the survivors who were sophisticated, the Phoenicians and the Cypriots. Now, the Cypriots I'm going to set aside for a moment because they had a wonderful island, but the Phoenicians didn't have anything like an island. They were vulnerable to all of the invasion routes of the Levant. They were also shipborne. In other words, great risk all the time in the Mediterranean. But they were anti-fragile. What does that mean again, Professor? You mentioned it before.
Right. So anti-fragile borrowed from Nassim Nicholas Taleb, meaning that they flourish in the time of chaos. They take advantage of the chaotic situation and expand out and take over. They are opportunists, as I think you've said, and that's exactly what they do here. And in fact, in going out into the Mediterranean and getting new sources of raw materials, like going all the way to Spain for silver, as it looks like, they are actually able to withstand the Neo-Assyrians by literally buying them off. They are paying tribute each year to Shalmaneser III and others, and as a result are not attacked and destroyed like some of the other cities. So they managed to use their I would say the advantage they have and access to the Mediterranean to flourish and even withstand the assaults by the Assyrians.
And the Cypriots manage, but they have an island fortress for them to manage on. Do they feel vulnerable to invasion by the Assyrians? I don't recall that the Assyrians were shipborne.
The Assyrians end up taking over some navies and having proxies and such. The Cypriots, though, even though they are on an island, they're not completely safe. In fact, towards the end, during the collapse, the Hittites say twice that they attacked Cyprus. Tutalila IV and Shupululiuma II both say in their inscriptions that they attacked Cyprus, probably wanting control of the copper. The Cypriots are able to maintain some sort of isolation for a while in the Iron Age, but and by isolation I mean from attack from enemies, but even they are not able to hold off the Neo-Assyrians. And we know, again, this is from the period after the book ends here, but I'll pick it up in the sequel to the sequel that I'm now working on. The Cypriots are eventually overwhelmed by the Neo-Assyrians and incorporated into their empire, such that we have later Assyrian inscriptions naming the various kingdoms from Iron Age and archaic Cyprus that the Assyrians say now owe them allegiance. So the Cypriots are going to be able to hold off the Neo-Assyrians, but not forever. And by 7th, 6th century, they too are overcome.
And now the failures, the Hittites. Now, consistent with this, we've talked about the climate and climate change, drought for 200 or 300 years, and the rivers changed directions, and you had to adapt. But there was also mention, Professor, of Egypt and Assyria and Babylon having a river system, and that is a plus for them that the Hittites do not enjoy. The Hittites have a river, but it's not anything comparable to Mesopotamia or the Nile.
That's correct. So water, just as it's important to us today, and we worry about, the drought in California and so on, water was important to them back then as well. And I do think that that is part of the reason why the Assyrians and the Babylonians were able to withstand the collapse, because they are on the Tigris and Euphrates River. And I think even though the Egyptians have their own internal problems, they're able to survive, shall we say, because they're on the Nile. And I would actually say in the Late Bronze Age, of the G8, as I've called them, the top four were the Egyptians and the Hittites, but also the Assyrians and the Babylonians. And of those four, the Hittites are the only one that don't survive. They're also the only one, as you've just mentioned, that are not on a major river system. You've got the Halys River, but that's not huge. And so, yes, water as a factor needs to be brought into the equation in terms of survival or not back then, again, just as it is today.
The Egyptians, the way you measure them, and this is following the IPCC report from the UN to look at all factors, is they're resilient, but just barely resilient. And so they are vulnerable to history. They're very vulnerable.
Yes, absolutely. So one of the things that I did in my research and in the analyses, which are in the final chapter of the book, and in part to show how relevant it is today, I turned to the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, who won a Nobel Peace Prize in 2007. And they're the ones that issue reports every year on climate change and all of that. But in 2012, they issued a report on extreme risk and resilience and how do you respond to catastrophes. And that is one of the themes that I follow throughout the sequel is the question of resilience. And what do you do? I mean, after something like Hurricane Katrina, how do you respond? So the IPCC, particularly in their 2012 report, they give excellent definitions. So for instance, they talk about something called an extreme impact event. And that is how they would have described a late Bronze Age collapse if they dealt with archaeology, which they don't. But they also give us great definitions for transformation, adapting, coping, vulnerability, fragility. And so I took their definitions and applied them to our societies. And that's part of how I rank them is, did they transform? Did they adapt? Did they cope? And the thing with just coping is that you're just trying to get through the day. You're just trying to make it to tomorrow. When you adapt, you're trying to, make it through next week, maybe next year. Transforming, you're trying to figure out how to succeed for the long haul. And that's where transforming comes in with the Phoenicians and the Cypriots, whereas the Egyptians are merely adapting at the most, but more likely coping. And so I found that using the IPCC definitions helped me in my rankings, but I'm also hoping that it makes it more understandable to general readers today as to how this might relate to us and why there might be lessons to be learned, even though those people went down and then tried to come back 3,000 years ago.
After 1177 BC, The Survival of Civilization, Professor Eric Cline. I'm John Batchelor.